We begin this hour in Washington with updates on the January 6th Select Committee's investigation into the riots at the Capitol.
That's right. CBS News and the Washington Post have obtained White House records of President Trump's activities on the day of the insurrection. The documents reveal a nearly 8-hour gap in his call log and daily diary. This unaccounted-for period of time raises serious questions about what the former president was doing while the attacks unfolded and how he was communicating with others. CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa broke the story with Bob Woodward of the Washington Post. He has more on their findings.
As chaos engulfed the Capitol building on January 6th, President Trump spoke repeatedly on the phone with allies and supporters, some of whom urged him to put an end to the violence. But none of those calls are reflected in the 11 pages of those White House records for January 6th given to the House Select Committee. There is a massive 7-hour and 37-minute gap in calls from 11:17 a.m. to 6:54 p.m., which includes the most violent period of the attack. CBS News has confirmed at least 2 calls during the attack that do not appear on the phone log or the daily diary. One call from Trump to Utah Republican Mike Lee, and another call to Trump from House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, who described it to Norah O'Donnell by phone as the violence was unfolding. The committee is now investigating whether the president and top aides used so-called burner or disposable phones to avoid scrutiny of their calls during that time. The logs do show several incoming and outgoing calls on the morning of January 6, including from Rudy Giuliani and former President Trump's chief strategist, Steve Bannon. At 8:37 a.m., Trump spoke with Bannon, who sources say told him to call Vice President Mike Pence and urge him to block certification of the election. Trump later did phone Pence, failing to persuade him. But that call is not listed in the records. There is a listing at 11:17 a.m. The president talked on a phone call to an unidentified person. CBS News has learned the Pence call was in that time frame. There's also a lengthy gap in records of the former president's movements during the attack, as recorded in his daily diary. At 1:21 p.m., the records note the president met with his valet. That notation signifies the president's return to the Oval Office from the rally. The next entry isn't until 4:03. The president went to the Rose Garden, it reads, where he participated in a video message to supporters.
This was a fraudulent election, but we can't play into the hands of these people. We have to have peace. So go home.
Bob Woodward said uncovering former President Trump's actions in those nearly 8 hours will be a key part of the committee's investigation.
These records seem to have disappeared. This is the day when they are protesting the January 6th effort to certify who's president. And the certification was that Joe Biden won. And 1,000 people attacked the Capitol right at that time that there's this gap. Who was he talking to? What was he doing?
On Monday night, Trump said in a statement, "I have no idea what a burner phone is. To the best of my knowledge, I have never even heard the term." A Trump spokesperson said that Trump had nothing to do with the records and assumed any and all of his phone calls were recorded and preserved. Robert Costa, CBS News, Washington.
Stephen Gillers is a professor at NYU School of Law, and he joins us now for more on this. Professor Gillers, welcome. It's great to have you with us. So what is the legal recourse, if any, for failing to turn over call logs? And could the former president or anyone in his administration face legal punishment if it is found he used so-called burner phones to conduct White House business?
Well, there's a duty to turn over documents if there's a subpoena, because a subpoena is an order of the Congress in this instance to do so. And so one legal consequence could be contempt of Congress for the Justice Department to consider in seeking an indictment.
Well, in his civil ruling, a federal judge in California ruled that it is, quote, more likely than not that former President Donald Trump corruptly obstructed justice on January 6th. he sort of went out of his way, this judge, to make that point. So first of all, Stephen, why would he do that? And from a legal standpoint, what could that mean for the former president?
Right. This is a very important ruling from Judge Carter in California. The January 6th committee was looking for emails between Eastman and whoever he corresponded with in the first week of January. And Eastman resisted that, went to court to stop it, to prevent it. The judge had to decide whether or not those emails could be disclosed when Eastman cited what's called a work product privilege, which is a well-recognized privilege in the law that entitles lawyers to refuse to turn over documents. But there's an exception to that privilege if the client of the lawyer has been using the lawyer's services to commit a crime or fraud. And so Judge Carter had to decide whether or not that was true here. And therefore, he had to investigate and address the claim by the committee that the client of Eastman, who was Trump, was committing a criminal act, thereby destroying the privilege. Now, what is especially noticeable about Judge Carter's decision is that the standard he used to address the so-called crime fraud exception is the same standard that the Department of Justice uses to decide whether or not to bring an indictment. Probably guilty, essentially, is what the standard is. Judge Carter found that it was more likely than not that Trump was committing a crime, two crimes, in fact, in those days in early January. That finding by a judge now, not two sides battling each other, but a federal district judge, that finding in a contested proceeding has to appeal to the Attorney General and the Department of Justice as they decide whether or not indictments are warranted of Trump and his inner circle for the behavior on and before January 6th.
Right. So, Professor Gillers, that was going to be my follow-up question to you, because considering Judge Carter's statement and his use of that standard, as you pointed out, this will clearly have implications for whether or not the Justice Department will move forward with indicting Mr. Trump, won't it?
Absolutely. What Carter is saying to Garland is, although not by name, is you have enough information here in what the January 6th committee has shown me, Judge Carter, to conclude that it is more likely than not that Trump was committing two crimes in this period. If you look at what is called the Justice Manual, which you could find by Googling it, it's the Department of Justice's policy rules, you see that the standard that Carter used to find the criminal conduct by Trump, violating two crimes, is the same test that the Justice Department uses in deciding whether or not to indict somebody. So Garland has now become the beneficiary of additional pressure to either indict or explain why he's not indicting Trump and others who assisted Trump in committing those crimes.
Professor Stephen Gillers, thank you for your expertise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.